The Joyful Friar podcast is made possible by the generous support of our friends. To support the podcast, please visit nathan-castle.com and donate today. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host. Today, ably assisted, at least for a little while, by Toto, the canine face of God. He's kind of fidgety this morning, so I don't know that he'll stay with us the whole while. I think he's got a lot of things he wants to do today. But he's helping me with the beginning of a podcast, at the very least, with our guest, David Lorimer. David's got a long resume, and I'm going to have him lead us through it himself rather than me try to just read everything that I found on his site. I was a guest of yours some time ago, maybe in the last year, do you think? Maybe.
Yes, indeed, only a few months ago. And we had a very interesting conversation on our webinar platform.
Yes, yeah. Well, David Lorimer, you're I had to look up what polymath actually meant. I love words, and I knew poly means many, and I wondered about math because math is makes me think of numbers and mathematics, but actually in the Greek it just has to do with learning anything, not necessarily numbers. So you're a person who knows a lot about it a lot.
Well, I've sort of developed myself in that way, and I suppose it goes back to, I suppose, the end of my university days at St Andrews University, where one of the requirements was to study philosophy, and that I probably wouldn't have studied philosophy if it hadn't been a requirement.
You and me
But
both.
I got very interested, particularly in existentialism, because I was studying French literature, and also theories of human nature, which brought in all sorts of interesting thinkers. And so that really set me off on a quest for, deeper understanding, both sort of metaphysically and ethically. I initially, when I came out of university, I went into the City of London, which is all rather unlikely. And so I was an international merchant banker for 2 years. And then I left that. And this was a crucial period in my development because what I did is I got a place at Cambridge to study the education course in 77, 78. And so I had a year, 76 to 77, which I was going to dedicate to reading. And so what I did is I arrived at Champagne, Moët et Chandon, the Champagne house, where I had already guided people around the champagne cellars as a student. And they kindly offered me a job in September, October 1976. Then again in April, May, and then June I went to Hennessy.
When you're talking about champagne cellars, are you talking about real bottles of champagne?
Oh yes,
All right.
yes. No, I was a guide round the champagne cellars
All right.
when I think there were 32 kilometers of caves and something like 54 million bottles, but there are many more now, I imagine. I took 4 boxes of books with me. And those books that I read during that year really, created the foundation for my life ever since. And I'd started on Colin Wilson a year or two before. Colin Wilson's famous book was The Outsider. And then the second one was called Religion and the Rebel. And so that introduced me to, Dostoevsky, Hermann Hesse, Arnold Toynbee, Oswald Spengler, A.N. Whitehead, T.E. Lawrence, Blake, and many others. And so I followed up on a lot of the reading and Swedenborg as well. But I had become interested in Swedenborg in my last year at university, partly because Baudelaire had written a poem called Correspondences, which was influenced by Swedenborg. And so that year, 76, 77, was really crucial in terms of developing my my mind and my culture, my reading, my interdisciplinary understanding. There was also Jung, J.G. Fraser, Radhakrishnan. So it was really quite a wide range of reading. And then I taught at Fettes and Winchester College between 1978 and 1986. Winchester College was founded in 1382, and some of the cleverest boys in the country go to Winchester College, and so it was incredibly stimulating.
Mm.
And I had a session which was called Div, and Div was where the Div Don, which is what I was, the teacher, could choose books for the students to read.
Is that
Uh,
div? Is that an acronym or something?
Yeah, division. It's div for division.
All right.
But it was really general studies. I mean, otherwise known as div.
All right.
Um, but what it meant is that the students would read these four books in the course of the half or the term, and then every 2 weeks they would write essays on the books. I would set them an essay to write, and so they got a very wide range of education, much wider than at most schools.
Hmm.
Uh, and the Don was able to, bring their own intellectual culture into the classroom, and so that was very exciting. And then in 1986, I left Winchester because I thought I didn't really want to spend the rest of my life teaching the same French proses,
Yeah.
how to translate thing into French or French into English, and
Yeah.
and so I was lucky enough to be offered a post as the director of the Scientific and Medical Network, which I'm still associated with. But
Man, that was still relatively young at the time, wasn't it?
yes, I was 34.
No, I mean the organization too.
Oh, the organization, yes, 19. So that was 78 6. So it was 13 years old
Yes.
at that time, founded in 1973. And that and then while I was at Winchester, I published my first book, which is sort of relevant to our discussion, which is called Survival, and the new version of it is called Survival,
And the
Death,
subtitle is Death at Transition, right?
Death is Transition, exactly. And I was quite influenced by Swedenborg, but also a huge amount of other reading. And the question I was trying to answer was, what evidence is there for the survival of consciousness? Does consciousness survive bodily death? And so I surveyed thinking about that really from indigenous people through Greek philosophy, through medieval philosophy, Enlightenment, 19th century, 20th century, to see what people had said about this. And
Yes.
then I had a chapter on how to assess evidence, where I brought in a a legal as well as a scientific perspective to evidence. And then I had chapters on out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences, apparitions, and purported communications from post-mortem communicants.
Yes.
And then I had a conclusion. And so I published that book when I was 32, which was quite young,
That what year was that, please?
1984.
84. Okay.
So my father thought I'd wasted my summer holidays by writing a book instead of enjoying myself.
I bet you enjoyed the writing.
Yes, it was I can't believe actually I wrote the book in 8 weeks. Yes, and I joined the Swedenborg Society Council
Would you
while I was
describe
in
the
London.
Swedenborg briefly for anybody in my audience who's not familiar with Sweden?
Yes, absolutely. Well, Swedenborg was an 18th century polymath, using that word, and he was a geologist, engineer, physiologist. He wrote 2 volumes on the brain. He was in charge of various projects in the Swedish government. He was a member of the upper house of Swedish Parliament, and then suddenly in 1743 he had a very fundamental set of experiences which opened the spiritual world up to him. So he was subsequently able to see into the spiritual world, to communicate with people from the spiritual world. And I suppose his best known book is called Heaven and Hell. And this relates his activities and some of the extraordinary encounters he had, including, and this would interest you as a theologian, with Luther, Calvin, and Melanchthon. And he was arguing against the vicarious atonement.
Yes.
So they were saying vicarious atonement is where it's at. And he said, no, we're actually responsible for ourselves. And where we go in the spiritual world depends on where we are inwardly when we leave the body.
Yes. And he ended up, people might be familiar with Swedenborgian churches. Became a movement of people that felt more at home in that exploratory world of mysticism than they did in conventional church services.
Yes, that's right. And so I found out about that. But the Swedenborg Society actually dates back to 1810. And so that wasn't that long after his death
Yes.
in 1772. So I wasn't involved in any of the churches, but I was involved with the Swedenborg Society. And indeed, I was president for 3 years, about 20 years ago.
Hmm. Seems like you lead just about anything that you get involved in.
Well, I don't know about that. I have had some interesting responsibilities. Um, I was also president of Wrekin Trust, which was founded by my mentor, Sir George Trevelyan.
Hmm.
But that no longer exists. We did about 40 years of work, and then it just came to a natural end. Um, so, including the instigation of a series of conferences that I still keep going, called the Mystics and Scientists conferences.
You just had that, didn't you?
Yes, we had that in April, and then our other big conference, which I initiated 30 years ago in 1995, is the Beyond the Brain conference,
Hmm.
and and that was I initiated this with the Institute of Noetic Sciences and Willis Harman in 1995, and this is really our consciousness conference, if you like,
Yes.
where we give people a chance to um, think about and become acquainted with research about the possibility of consciousness beyond the brain, which is what interests both of us.
Yes. Um, for people to be involved in your network, scientific and medical network, or any of the other things that you do, you've rattled off the names of lots of people that many of us have not read. You're very erudite. Can people with a modicum of intelligence and maybe some college follow along, even if they feel like they're the least educated one in the room? I'm
Well,
trying
I
to
would
help
say so.
myself. Yeah.
Yes, no, but I mean, all our programs are pretty accessible. I think the exception to that would be some of the work that we do with the Galileo Commission, where and there we have some technical talks as well,
Yes.
um, which are harder to follow and more use more technical language. But if you go to scientificandmedical.net, then you'll see what we put on. We have a weekly webinar
Yes.
in the two main conferences, and we also have more informal Monday, Wednesday, and Sunday events for members, including a meditation on Sunday evening. And
Mhm.
so we've got about 80 to 100 members who come together every Sunday evening to meditate together.
Frontier issues at the interfaces between science, consciousness, and well-being, that we accept the existence of a fundamental unifying and transcendent reality. Uh, uh,
Yes,
does that reality have personality?
I would say so. I mean, what you're talking about is in a sense the distinction between deism and theism.
Yes.
And I think the most of the members would accept the idea of a personal God. Some members are Buddhists, and so they take a different view.
Yes.
But I think that almost all members would assert a spiritual essence to humanity, and this was very much the idea of the founders. Going back over 50 years, and they were scientists and doctors, um, and they all had mystical experiences, and so they knew from first-hand experience that there was more to reality and than just the physical dimension.
Yes. But I'm interested in going a little bit beyond that too. Does spiritual for you presume personhood?
Yes, I would say for me it does absolutely.
Yeah. Well,
And
I've been a campus minister much of my career, so I've been working with college students, and Uh, my first book is on the Wizard of Oz. I'm very interested in literature and imagination. And his name is Toto, who is the dog in
Yeah.
and it means totality. I believe that he's the Christ in the story. He's the he's the canine face of God, the one that's all in all. That's what totality means, Toto. But I've run across students who are still, in their early 20s and they're trying to figure out what the world is and what they are and how they belong in it. And very often they'll presume a force because that's the main metaphor in Star Wars.
Okay.
The
Right.
Force is with you, and the Jedi learn how to manipulate the Force like young monks or something. They dress kind of like monks, and they'll often presume a Force, and then I'll ask them, um, I'll tell them that isn't that wonderful because the force is running through the walls in this building, you know, the electrical cords. All you have to do is stick the plug in and the force just turns on the computer. And then I'll say, shall we pray? We'll kneel in front of a plug in the wall. Well, of course not. That's an
No,
impersonal force.
no, quite.
Sometimes spirit gets called a force that's not personal. So you can love your shoes, but your shoes won't love you back. And if the force isn't a personal force, it can't love. It can be a lot of things, but it can't love unless it has personhood. At least that's the way I understand it. And in your network, there are probably other people with whom I listen and hear something different.
Yes, I mean, I agree, and I think that the classic, mystical or near-death experience in that respect is always an experience of love and light together,
Yes.
and it's almost always personified. In other words, it's a being of light. And
Yeah.
some people see saints and sages transfigured in their light bodies and emanating this love.
Yes.
So I think that's the universal power in the universe is this power of light and love and joy and life.
Yes. I've often wondered, I've lived on university campuses since I was 18, and I still do. And why isn't there a loveology department?
Yes, that's not a word I know, but I can understand what it means. And yes,
Made it up.
we've got groups working on this within the Galileo Commission, and we had a meeting quite recently called A Narrative of Love. And that's available on the Galileo Commission site, galileocommission.org/events. And and so I take this very seriously. And I I think that we need to develop, a much more visible philosophy of love and corresponding ethics. Because people in their personal lives, they know that love is the most important thing.
They do.
And yesterday I was at a funeral of a neighbor from the previous hamlet we lived in. And I said to her sons that she lived a life of love, and that was the most essential thing.
Yes.
Um, and
No,
they were
I want to live
pleased.
without it.
Exactly. No, I mean it's impossible. But we don't seem to translate that personal insight into its social implications. I mean, I believe that my second book, which is now called Resonant Mind, um, it was called Hole in One with a W, and I've subtitled it Life Review in the Near-Death Experience,
Hmm.
because what's very clear to me from the deep life review is that you can only understand it if we are effectively emanations from one mind, and that we share an underlying mind and the divine consciousness, if you like, which enables us to experience events from another person's point of view, which is what I call empathetic resonance.
Yes.
And if you realize that this is the spiritual law of the universe, that you're going to experience what it was like to be people, as it were, on the receiving end of your actions,
Yes.
then I think that's a real wake up call. It's really the golden rule,
Yes.
because in other words, just think of an education system where your first class and every level. This is loveology, if you like. You were told that the purpose of human life is to learn to love. That's it. I mean, well, it's not it, but I mean that's the essential
Yes.
point. Well, and I would add, and to grow in wisdom, that I think those two, growing in love and growing your capacity for love and your understanding and wisdom,
Mhm.
that seems to me what it's all about.
How would you put truth in there?
Oh, well, um, interestingly, the uh, Peter Dunov's he's Bulgarian, Christian Bulgarian sage that who's my teacher, if you like. His main principles are love, wisdom, and truth,
All right.
and they're related and complementary in the sense that love brings life, brings warmth to the heart, light brings wisdom to the mind, wisdom brings light to the mind, and truth brings freedom.
Ah,
Um,
yes,
and the truth will make you free.
it will.
And in that sense, freedom, the freedom of truth, is really of the essence because you're not free if you're ensnared in lies. And this is a huge problem,
Yes,
in the contemporary world because there are so many lies being spread,
yes,
um, and misleading information and narrative control. There's only one way of looking at things. If you don't share that view, then you're a heretic and we'll deplatform you. This is just appalling, and it's quite the opposite of the open-minded discussions and freedom of thought and speech that was championed by the great philosophers of the 18th century, and indeed it's in the American Constitution.
yes,
Now I know people critique it and say, well, people just can't be allowed to say anything. But the point is that then it can be the subject of public debate and argument. You don't take something away by shutting it down. You rebut it. You argue against it, and you argue on the basis of humanity.
yes.
Um, and this is what we're in danger of forgetting, is our humanity.
Well, I'm a Dominican. You must have run across us at some point, Aquinas and Albert the Great, and we were there at the beginning of the university system. It's why I joined the Dominicans because I wanted to know. I didn't know I wanted to be a polymath, but I did. I wanted to know a little about a lot. I didn't want to get a PhD and have some very esoteric knowledge of some very specific thing. I wanted to know a little about a lot, or a lot about a little, no, the other way around. And truth is our motto, Veritas. And I believe that the work that my prayer partners and I do, that I discussed when I was on your
Mm.
webinar, the progress that these wounded souls are making that helps them become uh, able to do more, to be more free, has to do with moving towards truth. Because a lot of times
Yes.
they formed an idea that they're responsible for something that wasn't their fault. They died in a car crash, that they were a little distracted, and they people can create all kind of narratives about themselves that have a kernel of truth, but that get so overblown that they're no longer they're well, any good lie has a kernel of truth at the basis of it, or it's preposterous. You know, if you're any good at lying, you don't make up something out of whole cloth. You start with some little element of truth, and then you add.
Or plausibility, at least.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. Well, sorry, I got off on that little content.
No, I mean the I was very struck. I gave a lecture on Radhakrishnan, who was a philosopher, president of India, this week, and um, in a quote from the Templeton Prize address given by B.K. Nehru, he says that God says, "I am truth," and the teach so that God is the instantiation of truth, truth itself, as it were, as
Yes,
opposed to a transmission of truth, which is through a human being.
a transmission of truth. Okay, I like that. Yes, and sometimes in contemporary conversation, people have lost track of the idea that what I was taught, truth has a definitive nature. There are things that are true before you have an opinion about them. And your opinion
Yes.
about them doesn't affect the truth of the thing. Uh, you know,
No, I mean that's a little bit like the distinction made by Plato and others between knowledge and opinion. And so opinion was more subjective, whereas truth has a more universal status.
yes, and it exists prior to your thoughts about it. It's just that there and living in the United States right now, there it's just it's we're the least united that I've ever seen us be, and a lot of it has to do with what we believe is true and how we talk with one another. And my opinion is as valuable as yours, and they're equal regardless before we even have a conversation. And it's hard to even have a conversation if people aren't willing to entertain a new idea or to set aside an old one.
No, there isn't any common ground, but I mean, I read an interesting article in from the New York Times by Lord Sumption, who was a High Court judge and philosopher of law and politics. And he said that what's happened, and this is more or less universal, is that there's been a decline of political culture, by which he meant that as fellow citizens, you should be able to listen civilly and disagree civilly with another citizen, rather than say, well, that person who holds that point of view has to be taken out.
Yes, or voted out.
Yeah, I mean, this is just not. There's a loss of civility, and I think this is a point made in a book I read about ethics, partly about ethics, by Julie Penness, which I reviewed recently, and she identified this loss of civility um, as a real failing, and I think it probably also has to do with the acceleration of life, that we're under so much pressure and information overload that we tend to become more impatient more quickly. And we don't have a kind of relaxed state of mind where or spacious state of mind anymore.
You know, David, I'm a confessor. I hear people's confessions. What do you
Yes.
think the most often confessed thing is? Time's up. It's it's impatience.
Impatience.
It's the
How
first thing that
interesting.
they say. And I say, tell me what you're like when you're impatient. What do you do or say when you're impatient? And then you hear the details of it. But a lot of people know that they have a root issue that's impatience.
How interesting. Because I mean, I ran I can believe that. I ran a program for many years called, well, it was called Learning for Life originally, and then it became Inspiring Purpose. And I had a poster format where people could say what they were good at and what they needed to work on. And a lot of young people said they needed to work on being more patient.
Yeah.
And so that entirely reinforces. But I think that's to do with the speeding up of technology,
Yes.
and this culture of immediate gratification.
Yes.
Um, that the machines get faster and faster, and your mind goes faster and faster with the machines. And so, if suddenly it slows down or it doesn't work, then people go into meltdown. And
Yes, and then sometimes we can be in the middle of a substantial conversation and the phone buzzes or the computer dings and it comes up on your phone and it's spam risk. I need to take this. It's essential that I talk to spam risk. Or I know that a plane crashed somewhere, or it's just all this information coming at us that gets in the way of just having a conversation.
yes, yes. And I remember a striking incident from a book on Ladakh by Helena Norberg Hodge, who's a friend. And this was Ladakh in the 70s, and they suddenly started getting modern technology, which was meant to save you time.
Yes.
And the grandmother said to the next generation woman, her daughter, said that, you've got all these time-saving devices now, but you don't have any time to speak to me.
Ah, good point. Yeah. Yeah,
I thought it was very instructive. It's like almost like a parable but what are we saving the time for?
absolutely.
You
Yes.
know?
Yeah. We're getting near the end of the time, and I know that we talked earlier. You have another commitment, so I want to honor that because we're nearing the time that you've devoted to this. Would you just talk directly to my audience and invite them to anything that you think they might like to take part in?
Yes, thank you. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation. I certainly have. And our activity of the Scientific and Medical Network can be found on scientificandmedical.net. Then our Galileo Commission on galileocommission.org. I'm rather short of time in some ways, and so I don't actually have time to manage my own website properly. Otherwise, I would give you that as well. But you can look me up online. And yes, I think the what I want to say is probably advice I would give to myself, which is slow down and stay in your center and make sure that every day you take time, to meditate, to pray, to contemplate, to be in nature. And this will nourish your being. And we need to be nourishing our being and our souls and our spirits, not just our body. So thank you very much.
And I would like to add to that to my audience that sometimes I feel like I'm about this deep. You know, uh, but I've been in I've been around people that you would frequent and conferences and things where I know that I'm not understanding very much of this, but it doesn't matter. You you can start where you are and benefit by wisdom that other people can pass along, and you have a lot of it that you're making available to people. So I'm grateful for the work you do.
Thanks so much, Nathan. It's been a pleasure.
Well, this has been this episode of the Joyful Friar podcast. Our guest, David Lorimer, can be found where he just said, and we'll have all that in the show notes. Remember that I'm praying for you, and when I do, my interest is in healing of trauma in particular, on this side of the grave or the other, either one. If you do it now, you don't have to do it later. But I'm interested in when I pray for you, I pray for wherever there is somewhere in you that there's something that is obstructive or that in some way you've had to learn to work around. Could we get to the root of it and heal it and get it out of the way? When I pray for you, that's what I'm doing. So anyway, this is the end of this podcast. Please join us next time. I'm Father Nathan Castle, your host of the Joyful Friar podcast. God bless you. Bye now.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Joyful Friar. Please like, follow, and subscribe. You can visit me at nathan-castle.com. Send me a message by clicking the contact button. God bless.
Have you ever had to do something so difficult that you had to deal with it in stages? Imagine dying suddenly with no forewarning, being in a car crash, a shooting, a drowning. You leave your body, but then what? How do you transition into the afterlife? For some, it flows all at once, but not for everybody. For some, the process of transitioning into the afterlife is interrupted. Maybe there's a need for rest or for learning, or maybe just the chance to adjust to such an abrupt experience. I'm Father Nathan Castle. I'm a Catholic priest. About 23 years ago, the Holy Spirit began to send me people who had died traumatically. They entered my dreams during sleep, showing me what had happened to them and asking for help. They had died and moved on, sort of, but they'd come to a moment where it was time to complete the crossing. With the help of the angels and saints and earthly prayer partners, we've assisted more than 300 souls as they complete their crossing. You can read about it in my book series. Afterlife Interrupted books are available on Amazon. You can also learn more by visiting my website, nathan-castle.com. God bless you.